Welcome, Gulpanag. Thank you so much for being with us on the note. Great to have you. You look resplendent as always.
Thank you, Maruk. You're very kind.
Okay. Gul, between the time I spoke with you and we chatted about, you being supporting the farmers' protests against the recently instituted farm laws, we have the Supreme Court that has stayed the laws as is or stayed the implementation of the laws and also set up a committee to look into the feasibility and the viability of these laws. Let me start with your first thoughts on this, since this just happened in the last 24 hours.
Well, firstly, I welcome the intervention of the court, and it goes without saying that staying these laws is the first step towards moving ahead for a final resolution. And this is very clearly an interim solution. It is not the final solution. And it appears that the Supreme Court, the Honorable Supreme Court, has rescued the government out of a very tight spot. And more importantly, it also appears, and as one would construe from media reports, that this has given some form of interim relief to the government that found itself in a very tight corner on these laws, and it's taken care of the more immediate concern of 26 January and the budget session, and that appears to be what one infers from it. I think the Honorable Supreme Court and the CGI, the Honorable CGI, have been rather scathing of the government in its interaction with the farmers and their failure of arriving at a resolution. However, what I find curious, as somebody who studied political science and who's a student of many things, is that we're now reaching a space where we are seeing an absolutely new role being played by the Supreme Court, which is something that only time will tell whether it's something which is good or bad or will have an impact in time to come. And that is the adjudication on the merits and demerits of a law without the constitutional ambit is something that has never happened before. The first time we've had the Supreme Court venture into territory and actually stay the implementation of laws, which in a way, given the scale of the protest, is very welcome. But what I'm yet to hear about, and maybe you could guide me if I've missed a reportage to that effect, is where do we stand on the constitutionality of these laws? This is a state subject. As per the 7th schedule of the Constitution of our country, agriculture is in the state list. And because we have 127 unique agricultural practices prevalent in our country, there is a reason the architects of our constitution kept it in the state. Now, should the center be legislating on something like this? And what's really interesting is in 2003, and I quote from a media report, the Vajpayee government brought in the model APMC law. And the Manmohan Singh government thereafter brought out the model APMC rules. Since then, 24 states have modified their own APMC laws to various extents. In 2018, the Modi government has drafted a model contract farming law. Both these laws suggest that the central government believed and upheld the fact that agriculture is essentially a state subject. Now, if that has changed, then I think it is incumbent on the executive to explain why there has been a fundamental shift in the way we view agriculture, which is at the heart of this. And what's even sad is that the Punjab government, despite being a stakeholder, because it implemented itself into the case, only brought up the constitutionality of it as an afterthought, it appears. Because fundamentally, this is about the center legislating on something which is in the 7th schedule of the Constitution.
No, the point that you make is absolutely what a lot of other commentators are also saying. The constitutionality of these laws, the Supreme Court has not even begun to comment on that.
The Supreme Court's defense, there aren't enough petitions to that effect.
Exactly.
The number of petitions are ironically about the implementation of the laws, why the laws should be implemented, why the protests should be stopped. Nobody except the Punjab government, and that too implementing itself into an existing petition. Brought out the constitutional aspect and the legality of it. So I think what really needs to be examined going forward, especially in light of this landmark intervention in a political executive role, clearly, by the Honorable Supreme Court is, why do we need two central laws to bypass an established precedent of how we have legislated in the past as far as agriculture is concerned? And most importantly, I think, to summarize the response to your question, lawmaking is a political role of the political executive, and it needs to have political solutions by engaging with the stakeholders who appear to be unhappy with this. Now, to have the Supreme Court intervene into a political matter, it appears would open the door to every executive question, every executive decision being questioned in time to come. And we don't know how.
Absolutely. It sets a very dangerous precedent, and that is the question. If the Supreme Court has to look at the aspect, then it needs to look at the aspect of constitutionality of these laws. And secondly,
then someone has to petition the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court cannot suo motu take cognizance, not in these times, of whether or not.
Ideally, it should. And secondly, why is the judiciary wading into matters, as you rightly put out, which are in the executive and legislative space? Now, having said that, the other curious thing about what the Supreme Court has done is it has set up this committee, and there are 4 members of this committee who have publicly, in this entire period where the farmers have been protesting, these 4 have publicly backed the government initiated and constituted farm laws. Don't you find that to be a curious mix of people, A? And B, does that make the farmers even more uneasy, according to you?
And which is why the position taken by the unions is that they don't see this as relief. And the very fact that the committee constitutes 4 members who've taken public positions in favor of the laws defeats the purpose of the committee. If you were to see, I mean, it appears as though, and initially there were thoughts that there would be a wider committee, there would be a more consensus building measure. Now that the Honorable Supreme Court, it can be construed, and it appears that the Honorable Supreme Court has taken up the issue of resolution of this matter in light of the complete abdication of the political solution that the executive should have found. I think the constitution of the committee would leave a lot to be desired, and also continue the trust deficit that has widened day by day from the start of the passing of these laws as ordinances in the middle of the lockdown at the height of the pandemic. So the trust deficit has grown. And you see it from the farmer's perspective. It appears that the authority, be it judicial, be it executive, is not to be trusted. I mean, that's the way the farmers would view it.
You have openly supported the farmers. You have been at the site of the protests. To a large percentage of our people in this country, explain in your words, why are you supporting the absolute, taking back of these laws or repealing of these laws as the demand is, in as simple terms? Because, a lot of jargon and a lot of information about laws goes to what you call in the media, and perhaps it's not very understandable for a layperson. So in your words, Gul, why are you supporting the repealing of these farm laws?
Let me clarify my position, Mahrukh. I support the position taken by the farmers, which incidentally happens to be repeal of the farm laws. If the farming unions had taken a slightly different position, I would support that as well. Because the farm unions have over 70 years worked tirelessly for the rights of farmers. And they are subject matter experts. Contrary to what a lot of reportage suggests, they are not uneducated and they are not uninformed. They are very, very erudite, very educated folks who have tirelessly fought for the rights of farmers. And that is a body I respect. And that is a body, the conglomerate of this body, as we say in Hindi and Punjabi, Kisan Jathebandis. It's the union of multiple unions. Now, why do I support the unions in their opposition to the farm laws? Firstly, a reform, and let me be clear, reform, agricultural reform in India is needed, and we can come to that at a later point. Reform needs to be arrived at as a result of consensus. It has to be something which is inspires the confidence of the people it will impact. Especially, this is not a reform that will impact 2%, 3%, 4% of the country's population. This is reform that will impact over 65% of this country's population. And consensus building is at the heart of democracy. We are the largest democracy, and we can't be reduced to being the largest democracy just on the basis of our electoral might. So firstly, I think the lack of consensus building in arriving at legislation, the manner in which these laws were legislated, pushed through as ordinances in the middle of a pandemic and a lockdown, by a government that holds majority in both houses of parliament without an outright urgency, suggests almost as if the government hoped that no one would protest. And as per an RTI that media reports have spoken of, they don't appear to be any conversations with the farmers about this. So all this while, there was some talk of how there were some consultations with farmers, but the RTI reveals, and as the Honorable Home Minister has admitted himself, there weren't consultations with farmers. Now, in a democracy, you've got to consult with the constituents that you are making the laws for. That's the heart of democracy. Now, so the legislative process being circumvented, then being passed by a voice note without the mandatory number of readings and a committee scrutinizing the bill. And thereafter, continuing with this till we've reached a stage where the Honorable Supreme Court has had to intervene. I think the trust deficit is what is at the heart of where we're at. I don't think the farming unions trust the intentions of the government. And I don't think the government has done much to win trust. Now, why am I here? I come from a farming family, and if I could flip this camera, I could show you, I'm sitting in the middle of the fields in Punjab right now. And I've been following the protests right from September. And in principle, being from a farming family, understanding why they are protesting against this is something that comes naturally to us. I mean, we don't need media reportage to understand about how these bills will impact the day-to-day livelihoods. But I think what personally was my inflection point, Mahrukh, was when all kinds of unsavory labels were being put out to describe and ascribe to the protests. As somebody who's 3 generations of my family has been in farming, and of course the armed forces, the two are tied together. How do you start calling anti-national people who've served the country? I mean, how do you start giving that label? And that brings into a question. I mean, it's not quite the answer you were looking for, but it's what was my reason for coming out. While there was obviously support and principle from the armchair that I was occupying at the time. But for me, being dragged down personally came as a result of these labels that were being thrown on these farm protests. In the past, whenever there has been some sort of dissent, this government has labeled, and votaries of this government have labeled the protesters in all forms, whether they are Naxals, urban Naxals, anti-nationals. New words have been invented that don't even exist in the legal lexicon. Now you are calling names, and terrible ones, to people who send their sons to the armed forces, CRPF, BSF, CISF, and the 3 armed forces, people who've already served in the armed forces, because every farming family is intrinsically linked to the uniform.
Right.
Are you trying to say that they are not patriotic? Because there is no greater insult than that. There is no greater insult. I do not think the patriotism of those in parliament can be questioned. The patriotism of those who've worn the uniform, who've lost sons to conflicts that this country has fought, cannot be questioned. And for me, that is the lowest point of public discourse we have come to. And that needs to be questioned, that needs to be protested, that needs to be objected to.
You know, you have also been to the site of the protest. And to many of us, there almost seemed like a festive air to the protest with everybody involved. But at the same time, there's a certain amount of desperation also. After all, most of these farmers have small holdings. They're coming away from their villages and their farmlands and coming to a site of protest and being there for days on end. What is the feeling there? What is the feeling that you got when you spoke to them and you were there at the site of the protest?
So firstly, when I reached, I've been going to the protest since early December. And when I first went to the protest, I had actually bought the government narrative. that this is only about Punjab farmers. And because I'm from Punjab, I do understand how troubled the Punjab farmer is by the farm laws. So I went there expecting to see only Punjab farmers. And let's be clear, the protest was led by the Punjab farmers. But there are farmers from all states that have that agriculture as their mainstay, be it Rajasthan, be it Uttar Pradesh, be it Madhya Pradesh, and of course Haryana.
Right.
Which was not what the media tried to tell us. I mean, in fact, the Honorable Chief Minister of Haryana says they support it, but his own constituents disagree with him. They don't allow him or his members of his cabinet to, apparently, from what newspaper reports are to be believed, move around freely. So there is a significant amount of discontent beyond Punjab. So that's something that I only discovered once I was at the protests. The first bunch of farmers I met, and I think I put something on Twitter, and since then I've really not had time to be on Twitter, was sitting and talking to farmers from Haryana. But then about the festive spirit, see, there's something that is intrinsically unique about the culture of Punjab, is that they have always contributed to all battles. And I'm not saying this is a battle, and this is a peaceful protest. But when I say battles, it could be the battle for independence with gusto. And they don't do it with a sense of morosity and sadness and despondency. They do it willingly and lovingly. That's how people from Punjab have always been. We've been, every single invasion that has happened towards India has passed through Punjab. And there is a certain culture that Punjabis embody. And by Punjabis, I mean Punjabis of all faiths. It's not just restricted to Sikhs, who also happen to be Punjabis, but Punjab as a culture embodies a certain spirit.
Right.
And let's also celebrate that spirit. That is the spirit that has been celebrated in every battle that we've seen this country fight. Military ones at that, and of course the ones that we fought against the British were to a large extent supported and a very large extent led by people from Punjab. And these are people who go happily into battle. We have war cries of the Sikh regiment, which is De Shiva Bar Mohe Hai, Shubh Karmante Kabahu Na Daru, or So Jabalai Laru, Nishchay Kar Apni Jeet Kuru. They are willingly going to die and happy to do because they believe in it. So that is cultural. So when these war cries are part of our culture, and that's why they've been appropriated by the Sikh regiment and by the Punjab regiment, by the Sikhalai, and that is what makes us who we are. That's what makes that's the culture of the land, which is why it is I know it's a really long rambling answer, but most people don't, because they don't culturally understand Punjab.
No, I don't think any of your answers are rambling. I think you speak with a lot of passion, and that is what is required. That I think is what we are.
They are doing this happily. Fighting for their rights has come naturally to Punjabis for time immemorial. I mean, since and specifically Sikhs, the birth of the Khalsa can be traced back to 1699. They have willingly fought for people who don't even impact their day-to-day lives, for others. And they've done it happily. So, and again, coming from an armed forces family, I also know that this is synonymous with the way soldiers operate. They don't go sad into battle. They would not go into battle if they were sad. So it's the way culturally they're motivated for centuries now, 3 centuries to be precise.
But having said that, this battle seems to be, or at least at this point looks to be, a long one. You spoke about the constitutionality and how the courts haven't even looked at that. Whether the petitions have come or not, this seems like the committee will take its time, give back the recommendations. The Supreme Court might make its decision or pass an order based on that particular recommendation, whereas the constitutionality still remains a far, far cry at this point. And what the farmer unions have said over and over again is that we want a complete repeal of the laws. We will not accept anything else. That's going to take a while from what it seems right now. How long are they prepared to protest and fight?
Maruk, that's a difficult question. And the reason for asking for a complete repeal, and if I had to construe a response, I'm not a spokesperson of the unions. I support their right to protest, and that's why I'm here. But it would appear that they feel that any law that has been passed without consultation with the stakeholders is bad law. And I think let me also stick my neck out here and say that this is just not about the farmers. This is about in the future of India's legislative process. That can you push laws through like this, through ordinances, and then with voice votes without the mandatory readings and scrutinies that require for a law to be made? Are we going to proceed with reform like this? Are we going to take away the right to legal remedy, which is one of the contentious issues of the amendment to Agriculture Produce Market Committee Act? Are we going to not allow pressure groups to have their say? Are we, and most importantly, are we going to let this discourse become acceptable and become the norm? So I think the questions these protests have brought to the fore are actually fundamental questions about the functioning of India's democracy. Are we going to push laws without consultative process? Yes or no? That's a question that needs to be answered. Are we going to start labeling anti-national everybody who opposes the government? Let's be very clear. The Supreme Court has upheld the right of anybody to have a peaceful protest, and particularly the farmers. So are we going to label people because they protest? And that's what this government has consistently done. You don't like us, you're against us. We are for India, but we may potentially be, we are for the Indian state, we support the Indian state, we're willing to die for the Indian state. But the government is not the Indian state.
Right.
The appropriation of the idea of the Indian state by this particular government is deeply troubling. Criticism of the government and its policies is not criticism of the Indian state. And these fundamental questions, Mahrukh, that have been thrown up impact far more than just 60% of the population. These are very, very fundamental questions. Are we going to make laws like this? Are we going to muzzle dissent and label them to be all kinds of things, especially in this light when I'm at the risk of repeating myself, when these people have worn the uniform of the country, which very few people in parliament have made. I think 3 people have worn the uniform for the country in this present parliament. 4, if you count Anurag, who's a territorial army officer.
But, Gul, there are also a large number of market economists who have nothing to do with the current dispensation and the government, who are just extremely well known for their experience and their analysis. They have come to the conclusion that these farm laws are actually reformative. They're going to help farmers, and Indian agriculture needs reforms. What would you say to them? After all, there has to be a merit in that argument. And shouldn't farmers hear that part also?
Which is the process that should have been followed before these laws were drafted. That is the process that should have been followed. Let me address the question, and say very clearly we need reform. Agriculture has needed reform for over 3 decades. The last kind of agricultural reform we saw was what heralded the Green Revolution, and made us from being, without being insufficient in food, to having a position today where we are grain surplus.
Right.
Now, yes, reforms are necessary, not just from the way the produce is procured, subsidized, and sold, but also to how the produce is grown and what produce is grown. For instance, the water table in Punjab has gone from 35, 40 feet in areas to today bores being dug to 200 feet to grow paddy. Do we need to grow paddy? But these 2 crops were incentivized at the start of the Green Revolution because that is what the country needed. And I don't think anybody is happy growing crops, but say, for example, paddy. Paddy is sucking out the entire groundwater of Punjab and Haryana. But they were incentivized, and therefore the farmers are trapped in a cycle of paddy and wheat. And these are conversations that need to be had. The same set of people who came and convinced the farmers grow paddy and wheat.
Right.
Now need to come and convince them and say, stop growing paddy and do XYZ. That is the job of agricultural scientists and agricultural economists. That's how you come and do it. The Punjab and Haryana farmer didn't dream up the idea of using genetically modified seed to increase yield, to increase input cost through fertilizer and pesticide. This was done through a process. And mind you, the process didn't take very long. It's not impossible. But if we want to take shortcuts to reform, then you're going to have what's happening right now. Reform is needed, but reform needs to be consultative. It needs to be educative. You cannot push reform down the throats of people who feed the country. I think the subsidy regime needs to be relooked at. It needs to be better examined and better understood. A bulk of the agricultural subsidy today benefits the consumer and not the farmer. From the farmer standpoint, it's a negative subsidy. The positive subsidy impacts consumers like you and me who buy food and who are beneficiaries of the public distribution system. So the entire subsidy regime needs to be fairly relooked at. And yes, the economists are right. It needs to be re-examined. Last but not least, agriculture is not a profitable vocation. Bulk of India's farmers, and let me be specific with regard to Punjab and Haryana, the holdings are 3 to 4 acres. That is the average land holding. You can do the maths in terms of what is the yield in Punjab and Haryana. The yield is approximately per acre is in the region of 20-21 quintals. Do the maths with MSP and figure it out. And let me see how many people come back and say, yes, you can survive in this amount of money. So this concept of obfuscation of matter. These are rich farmers. 3 to 4 acres is the average land holding in Punjab and Haryana, average land holding. There are rich farmers, just like there are rich industrialists, like the people who top the Forbes list in all over the world. But are those the exception or are those the rule? There are probably a handful of rich farmers that can be counted on the fingers of both hands and both feet. But literally, it's that number. Anybody who has holdings in excess of 20 acres would qualify as a rich farmer. But guess what? We had a ceiling of land imposed of 18 acres 35 years ago. So how can that be relevant today? So I think there is a deeper understanding in the mainstream space that is required of how agriculture operates and how lies like these can be perpetuated. Rich farmers, rich farmers, rich farmers. When this data is available in the public domain.
You know, you mentioned that there needs to be knowledge in mainstream
the reform question. Yes, reform is needed. We need reform to revisit our agricultural practices and make sure we have reasonable topsoil. As per now, and as per media reports of agricultural scientists, of pieces written by agricultural scientists, we have 45 to 50 years of topsoil left in Punjab because of the huge amount of fertilizer and pesticide we're putting. That can't go on. And unless and until we reform the way agriculture is done in Punjab, by the time my son is my age, this soil is going to be useless. So that is definitely needed. The subsidy regime needs to be relooked at. And because agriculture is a not-for-profit vocation in India, it needs to be subsidized. Just like LPG is subsidized, just like petrol, that's a different conversation. Subsidy can play everywhere. I'm not saying there is the justification for agricultural subsidy is why LPG needs to be subsidized. The justification for agricultural subsidy is perhaps the greatest. And the flag bearer of market economy is America, and they have the highest agricultural subsidy in the world. And after they brought about agricultural reforms, the entire produce is procured by 4 corporates in America. 4 corporate houses procure the entire produce of America. Is that what we want setting up for India? Because I mean, there's a very important question that needs to be asked here of what is the final intent of these reforms. I read something which is a bit alarming in a comment made by the Niti Aayog. One was that there's of course too much democracy, which I don't want to talk about because enough people have spoken about that. But the other thing was how we need more big business, and how big business is what helps the economy grow, and small business gets in the way. I mean, I'm just sort of summarizing.
Paraphrasing it, yeah.
I'm not even sure how I should be reacting to that, and I'm not even sure why nobody else is talking about it. So reform is needed, Mahrukh. There's no two ways about that. The manner in which credit is given to farmers, the entire structure of the way farming is done has to be reformed in India. But it needs to be done at the state level, because agriculture is essentially a state subject. And today this government controls more than two-thirds of the state governments. Why is it not demonstrating how agriculture can be reformed in its states, rather than try and do this piecemeal in a manner which will look like it's overreach by the center?
Okay, so you mentioned that, knowledge about agriculture deliberating on the petitions regarding various aspects of these farm laws. In the recent deliberations, he made a comment saying that I can't understand why women are part of the protest. There was a lot of backlash to it. Your comments, Gul, on why women are part of these protests?
Over 10 crore women. Can you guys hear me? There's been an internet issue.
No, we can hear you. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Over 10 crore women in this country are directly engaged in agriculture and therefore impacted by agriculture. The average family in Punjab, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, UP that farms is the family farming. It's not just the husband who is farming and the wife is sitting at home. He cannot make ends meet if his wife is not assisting him in the fields. So there is an absolute very large role that women play in agriculture in India, and perhaps the only vocation in the country where women are equally represented. Women are equally represented in agriculture because there is no choice. So I don't want to go into the semantics of why women and children have been kept at the protest, but I would just welcome those who question why women and children are at the protest to visit the protests. They're not that far. It takes about 1 hour 20 minutes from central Delhi to get to Singhu, and it takes about 1 hour 45 to get to Tikri. It's not that far, and you can visit them, and you can ask these women why they're there. But I think that it suffices to say that 10 crore women in India, and this is as per the last census, are engaged in agriculture. Shouldn't these women be out there protesting what affects them? And the assumption that they have been brought to the protest is one that's deeply patriarchal. You're assuming the women don't have free will.
I hope the ones who are making such comments are listening to what you're saying. Gul, you're a huge celebrity. You're part of a major part of the Hindi film industry and other film industries as well. During these farm protests, we've seen a large number of celebs, artists from Punjab and Haryana, and more from the north, who have shown their support or at least made a comment about the farm protests and the farm laws. However, the response by the Hindi film industry has been quite muted. Do you wonder why? Or are you not surprised?
I know exactly why. It's not just about the farm protests. It's about anything that involves taking a public position. And when big stars in the film industry have taken public position, retribution has been fast and brutal. Retribution by those who have the support of the government, or those, and essentially when big public figures speak out to support something which is to add their voice or to amplify the voice of, say, protesters, it's always taken to be as them taking on the government, and which is not taken kindly. I mean, we've seen what's happened with Aamir in the recent past. We've seen what's happened with Shah Rukh. We've seen what's happened with Aamir, Shah Rukh, and Salman. And people have gone after their films that are releasing and tried to stay the releases, tried to damage the cinema halls. Some people have tried to do campaigns to take away their right to earn livelihood through getting their endorsements cancelled. So the thing is, they don't feel probably it's worth their time to do this. And we haven't yet reached a stage where public figures have used their reach to impact public opinion beyond social causes like polio, or I'm hoping now the vaccine for COVID. We've traditionally seen celebrities world over particularly in the in the Americas. And America is again a reason the reason I quote America is because you've seen the public positions the really powerful public figures in America took recently and over the last 7, 8, 9 months, 10 months. Because there you don't get persecuted for your political views. The institutions are still strong enough to protect you from unjustified persecution, from the overreach of the coercive power of the state. So here we are in a place where the migrants were allowed to walk home. No provisions were made for their safe return to the homes, between the tussle between the center and the respective states, and the court just didn't think it was worth their time to intervene. And there were women, children there too, being made to walk. They were really being made to walk this time by the apathy of both the central and the state governments.